The blinding white light of the spotlight burned my retinas, but I couldn't blink. I wouldn't let myself. The microphone stand felt like ice against my sweaty palms. Next to me, the scent of vanilla and heavy hairspray hung in the air. It was her, Juice Newton. My name is Martha. I am 72 years old now, and the heavy silence of that packed arena right before the first chord struck still rings in my ears every single night of my life. To understand how I ended up freezing under those stage lights, you have to know how desperately quiet my life was before 1981. I was a waitress at a lonely, fluorescent-lit truck stop right off the interstate. The loudest sound in my world was the clattering of heavy porcelain plates and the endless hum of the neon sign in the window. The smell of cheap bleach and burnt coffee seemed permanently soaked into my skin, resting deep in the calluses on my heels no matter how long I soaked my feet at night. Every morning at 5 o'clock, I drank the bitter leftover brew from the night shift, watching the frost melt slowly on the diner's front window. I didn't have much to say to anyone. My words were trapped behind a thick wall of shyness that felt like poured concrete in my throat. I was just another ghost walking around in a faded pink uniform, living a life painted entirely in dull shades of gray, punching a clock until the day I would inevitably disappear into the dirt. Then, a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October changed the fundamental frequency of my pulse. The cook's old, battered transistor radio in the kitchen, usually spewing nothing but static and weather reports, caught a crystal-clear signal. An acoustic guitar kicked in, then a voice. It was raw, pleading, cutting straight through the heavy stench of frying grease and stale cigarette smoke. "Just call me Angel of the Morning, Angel." I dropped the heavy tray of water glasses I was holding. It shattered loudly against the linoleum floor, but I didn't care. Juice Newton's voice wasn't just singing through a speaker. It was reaching out and grabbing me by the apron strings. I went straight to the downtown record store the second my shift ended, my uniform still damp. I wore the grooves out of that vinyl record. I learned every breath, every pitch, every subtle crack in her voice, singing alone in my dark living room until my throat physically ached. Her voice was the warm color my cold world was desperately missing. When the local paper printed a small black and white ad announcing she was coming to the State Theater, my stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. The tickets were $30. Back then, to a girl like me, that was a week's grocery money. I worked double shifts, taking every extra table, counting dimes and quarters from my tip jar into a rusted coffee can on my dresser. But when I finally walked up to the box office window, the handwritten cardboard sign taped to the glass hit me like a physical punch to the jaw. Sold out. The autumn rain started to pour right then, soaking through my thin cardigan, perfectly matching the heavy, sinking stone that formed in my chest. I sat on the wet curb outside the theater for hours, watching the neon marquee reflect in the dirty puddles by my cheap shoes. My chest burned with unfairness. I wasn't going to let it end sitting in the damp cold. I just couldn't. I emptied my pockets for a nervous scalper in a worn leather coat exactly 2 hours before the show doors opened. I gave him $70, the gold locket my grandmother left me, and the last shred of my pride. As I finally pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the theater, the sudden heat of 3,000 human bodies hit my face. The dense air tasted like cheap draft beer, stale cigarette smoke, and pure electricity. I squeezed my way aggressively to the third row, ignoring the curses from people I pushed past. The floor was sticky under my shoes. The low hum of the waiting crowd was a physical vibration rattling through my ribs. My heart pounded so violently against my sternum, I thought the stranger standing next to me could hear the thud. Then the house lights dimmed to a pitch-black pitch, and the screaming started. The spotlight cut through the dark like a knife. There she was, Midway through the set, she started the slow, acoustic opening chords of The Sweetest Thing. She walked directly to the edge of the stage, stopping right above my head. She looked down at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces, asking who knew the high harmony. My hand shot up into the air before my brain could even process the fear. She pointed directly at my trembling fingers. "Come on up here, sweetheart," she said into the microphone. A massive security guard boosted me over the metal barricade. My legs felt like melted water as my shoes hit the wooden stage. The blinding white light erased the sea of faces, leaving only the dark void and her. She handed me a spare microphone. The metal casing was freezing against my skin. She smiled, gave me a small, reassuring nod, and I opened my mouth. The sound that came out of the speakers wasn't the shy, broken waitress. It was a woman finally breathing air for the very first time. We sang the chorus together, her powerful voice wrapping securely around my shaking harmony, carrying me higher than I had ever been in my entire quiet life. The walk back to my apartment that night took 3 hours, but the soles of my shoes barely touched the concrete pavement. The midnight air was freezing, biting at my cheeks, but I was burning up from the inside out. The high-pitched ringing in my ears felt like a heavy gold medal hanging around my neck. When I finally unlocked the door to my quiet, dark apartment, the familiar silence tried to swallow me whole again, but it completely failed. Something fundamental had physically shifted in my chest. I didn't suddenly become a famous singer. I went right back to the fluorescent lights of the diner at 5 o'clock the very next morning. But I walked differently. I spoke louder. The faded pink uniform didn't define who I was anymore, because for 3 perfect minutes, I wasn't invisible. I had shared the air, the notes, and the bright stage with someone who pulled me out of the dark and made me feel completely, undeniably alive. I am sitting in my worn armchair now. The joints in my hands ache terribly when it rains, and my hair is entirely white. On the heavy oak table next to my reading lamp is a small, cheap wooden frame. Inside it, protected by scratched glass, is a faded, yellowed piece of paper. The purple ink is barely visible anymore, but I don't need to read it. It's the torn ticket stub from that Tuesday night, the one that cost me my grandmother's gold locket. I run my wrinkled thumb over the wooden edge of the frame. Sometimes, when the house gets too quiet in the middle of the afternoon, I close my heavy eyes and I can still smell the vanilla hairspray. I can still feel the freezing metal of that microphone in my grip. And I know, deep in my tired, aging bones, that I actually lived.